we have a nice partnership actually with KAS in doing these meetings, because we find that our core interests are pretty much the same, especially KAS and India, which is nice. Okay.
Good afternoon, Rajiv.
Good afternoon, Suresh. Wonderful to see you.
Good to see you. Long time.
Well, I suppose as long as the corona age.
Do you think the vaccine will make any difference?
Can you check on my depth?
I certainly am very optimistic, and I think we should look forward to 2021 with
Absolutely.
a great deal of hope. I think that is where we will start working at our optimal level. Although I know that some of us have been working probably harder in the corona age than before.
Yep. There's no difference now actually in the time.
Yeah.
Everyone's at work constantly.
Yeah. In fact, I find that earlier there was a gap between 2 or 3 meetings. Now there's no gap. Since it's all on the same platform.
Shagnik, are you going to give a signal for us to begin?
I think you can start. People.
Yeah, great. Manjeet, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Manjeet Kripalani, and I'm the Executive Director of Gateway House, a foreign policy think tank in Mumbai. Along with our partner, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, we welcome you to our first meeting of 2021. This decade is starting on a positive note, with the vaccine now being administered everywhere, and a serious reassessment of the global economy and institutions underway. One multilateral grouping that has the strength and the mandate to encapsulate both is the G20, with 80% of world GDP, 75% of global trade, and 60% of the world population. The job will fall to a most interesting trio of countries, the three I's, leading the grouping till 2023. Italy, a developed country, is president of the G20 this year, followed by Indonesia and India, two dynamic developing countries in 2022 and 2023. To discuss this, we have an excellent panel. Marco Felisati, the B20 or B20 Business 20 Sherpa of Italy. He is the Deputy Director of Internationalization at the Confederation of Italian Industry. Dr. Basri, the former Finance Minister of Indonesia, who has extensive experience in finance and policy making. And Sanjeev Sanyal, who we all know, Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India, a scholar public servant with extensive private sector experience. He was also the co-chair of the G20 Framework Group in 2021. Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia will moderate this meeting. A few house rules. The panel discussion will run for about 35 to 40 minutes, followed by 20 to 25 minutes of moderated Q&A with the audience. Kindly write your questions in the chat box, identify yourself, and we will take up the questions as they come. Thank you. Rajiv?
Thank you, Manjeet. Indeed, we have a distinguished panel, and it is my privilege to serve as the moderator today. Gateway House, based in India's business capital, Mumbai, has a strong track record of studying and researching on G20 related issues and of organizing and contributing to deliberations held on the T20 channel, the Think Tank 20 of G20 channel in the recent years. This particular panel discussion today forms an important part of our endeavors to disseminate latest research and insights into G20. You could even say that this is, in a way, our humble contribution to start preparing India for the big year in 2023 when India would hold the presidency of this important forum. As we all know, G20 represents a vast domain of policy making, intersectoral knowledge, and a multiplicity of constituencies ranging from governments of advanced and emerging economies and a host of important engagement groups around the world. But as Manjeet said earlier, our focus today will be on three facets: the macro, the sectoral, and the country perspectives of these three countries, Italy, Indonesia, and India. We have to recognize that India is not a part of the present Troika, but eventually, as I said, this is designed to help India to start preparing for these very august responsibilities. I recognize a number of very important people in the audience. I will not name them, but I want to welcome each and every member of the audience, and I take it that their presence today reflects their deep interest and commitment to advance the causes dear to G20. So with this very brief introduction, as is now the custom of Gateway House, we are straight away going into a question-answer session, which will allow our panelists to express their views and articulate their perspectives to us. And I should add that I'm particularly grateful to Marco Felisati, who is here only for a limited time because there's a direct conflict of interest with another conflict of timing with another item on his agenda. So my very first question goes to him. Marco, it is said that the G20 is at a crossroads today, as is multilateralism. This has been exacerbated by the unique and unprecedented crisis of the pandemic, or caused by the pandemic. The Saudi presidency, with the 2 virtual summits held last year, secured quite a few tangible achievements, such as the debt service suspension initiative, the G20 plan, the COVID strategy. So in that context, my question to you is, how does Italy intend to take this forward, especially on the health and on the economy?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. And first of all, apologize for being obliged to quit before the conclusion of this important webinar. But as you can imagine, these days that preceding the inception meeting of the B20 are extremely demanding. I would underline at first the Troika dimensions. If you look at Italy, Indonesia, and India, well, you will find complementarity and differences as well, but I think that this Troika will be fundamental for the overall process of the G20, and in particular for the engagement group research to business, for many various reasons that all belong to our industrial and productive tissue, heavily based on manufacturing, devoted to export, to international exchanges. And I really appreciate your question around multilateralism, which is, allow me the euphemism, the big elephant in the room, the major missing element. The pandemic has taught us a lot of lessons, but in my judgment, the most relevant and the most important is that our global governance is at the same time intrinsically fragile and fragmented. And once the international community is confronted with global crises, such as the pandemics, then you need global responses, coordinated actions. And I regret to say that what we observed, but not only in Italy, I would say all over the world, the first reaction in February, March last year was of closure. All nations, all governments tried to close down and find remedies within their own territories, whereas the requested answer was exactly the contrary. More coordinations, more decision-making sharing, more coordinated governance. That means more multilateralism. But I also detect some encouraging signals, yet not enough, of course, to say that we are equipped to face, to confront with the epochal challenges and to overcome the crisis, but still something is moving. Very hard to predict in what directions and with what consequences. But 2020, that has been an unforgettable year, has also witnessed some important advancements, notwithstanding what will happen with the new approach to the multilateral sphere by the new administrations of the United States, and what will happen, if something will happen, we hope, at the WTO level, for example, that strongly needs a profound reform. We have seen major preferential trade agreements being approved, some other entering into force, some other going ahead for ratification. We have seen a major awareness in all our systems as long as the health and life sciences sectors are concerned. And our commitment as a B20, as Italian cycle of the B20, is to put a lot of emphasis on both health and life sciences and to systemic threats, global emergencies. Yesterday, 2020, was the pandemic, but tomorrow, God knows what can be around the corner. Migrations, desertifications, access to water, massive cyber attacks, dramatic fall in the climate change evolution. I think, and we are committed to convey sound policy recommendations in order that the business and the international community as a whole will be more prepared, more resilient, more inclusive.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marco, for a very clear answer that you have provided to the very first question. Let me now move to Dr. Basri, still staying on the broader macro perspective. Does a divided international leadership facing serious geopolitical tensions give you confidence, Dr. Basri, about G20's capability to navigate the fault lines successfully? You are muted, sir, so you can unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia. Good evening or good morning for all the participants, the distinguished participants. Perhaps to answer or to address your question, let me share with you my experience with G20. Because before I became a finance minister, I was a deputy minister of finance for G20, and I've been working for G20 since 2006. Yeah. And then also experienced the global financial crisis with the leaders meeting, because initially the G20 was only sort of like a club for Minister of Finance and Governor of the Central Bank initially. So I would like to say that perhaps the G20 was in the top form or was really in power during the global financial crisis. And the reason behind it was because we had the common platform at that time. Yeah, the global financial crisis. So from my experience, at that time, it was relatively easy to make a sort of like a coherent or concerted effort for all the members of the G20. I was a Sherpa for Indonesia at that time. From the Indian side, if I'm not mistaken, was Montek Ahluwalia. Yeah, so it was relatively easy because we had to face the problem, to overcome the problem of the global financial crisis. And after that, the recovery was taking place, but uneven. And the role of the G20 is slowing down, declining, because we don't really have the common platform at that time. Now we do understand exactly what you said, Ambassador Bhatia, regarding the geopolitical divide, the decoupling between US and China, the US position in the previous G20, for example, the one in Germany, that during President Trump's administration, not very supportive to the issue of the multilateral, even to the maybe to the policy of the G20. Yeah. So, but I can see one of the potential can be a sort of like a common platform that can be used to make this G20 become more effective, exactly like Mr. Felicity mentioned. We are facing a global problem now, the pandemic. Yeah, so once we have the common platform, I do believe that there is a possibility for us to work together. So in this particular issue, I could mention now, if we are talking about the macro policy all over the world, I think everyone believes, yeah, before all of us, you know, especially finance minister, always worry about the issue of this fiscal sustainability. But the theme of the fiscal policy all over the world now is do whatever it takes. And then if you look at the allocation of funding, I think all over the world just focusing on three things: health, social assistance, and support to the small medium enterprise. It happens in Indonesia, I do believe also similar in India, in the US, and also other countries. So we can see that we do have a common platform here. Yeah, the issue is, how do we manage this common platform to bring G20 in order to make the concerted effort to address the issue that Mr. Felicity mentioned. Yeah, we can discuss later on. Perhaps we should take this opportunity for the recovery later on. We need to talk about the post-COVID, not only about the pandemic, about the sustainable development, about the issue of the inequalities. So I understand there is an issue about this geopolitical divide, but I am quite optimistic, you know, because we do have the common problem now. The G20 can be more effective, like what we had back in 2008 during the global financial crisis. I hope I address your question, Ambassador Bhatia.
Thank you very much. You indeed answered my question directly, and I'm really grateful for it. moving to Sanjeev ji, to you now. We know that you have been part of the finance track and you have co-chaired the framework working group discussions last year. We'll ask a couple of questions on that a bit later, but first, could you please share your assessment of the G20 today? It is famously said by experts that G20 is large enough in economic clout, small enough for effective decision making, flexible enough in its agenda, and strong enough in terms of professional expertise available to it. So in this context, my question to you is G20 a truly premier international forum, or is it a talk shop?
Well, thank you, Ambassador Bhatia, for giving me this opportunity, and to Manjeet and to all of you, greetings. In order to judge whether or not G20 is living up to its expectations, I think what we first need to do is to decide what is it supposed to do. Well, what G20 is supposed to do is provide a global coordination and leadership and some sort of a framework for governance of global commons. That's basically what's supposed to do. I think it's right that it is small enough to get things done and flexible enough in its agenda, while being large enough in clout in order to be able to get things done. So in that sense, it's right. But I don't think I would say it's quite unfair to say there's just a talking shop, because I think particularly over the last 1 year, I would argue that it has actually been quite effective in getting quite a lot done. Now, maybe the cynics would want much more, but as I will show you, it has done a lot more than people give it credit for. Now, in order to understand what I'm saying, you need to first consider what is the counterfactual. If G20 had not existed, what would have been the situation? And to get a sense of that, just go back to February, March of last year, when there was clearly a breakdown of information and knowledge and coordination as far as the health response was concerned. The WHO was clearly floundering and not in control. Other institutions that are there, UN or any other institution, were clearly not being able to cope with things. As Marco pointed out, there was clearly a breakdown in multilateralism. Everybody grabbed for a much more local, nation state kind of solution to various problems. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just saying that is probably natural response to a sudden shock of this kind. But there was clearly no international leadership. There was also a situation where there were real fears of, breakdown in global trade, of emerging market crises happening, of financial markets going into a downward spiral and breaking down all kinds of things. Now, a year later, what do we have? I think we have done rather well. I mean, financial markets have revived. There's clearly lots of liquidity floating around in the world that's holding things together. Financial flows are still happening. There's no breakdown. There hasn't been, some emerging markets, not unexpectedly, have had problems, or even, there have been large slowdowns in the economy, but there's no breakdown or emerging market crisis of the kind we were fearing in the beginning. At least goods trade and even online services trade is that framework is still alive. Maybe it slowed down, but I would argue not much more than would be natural to such a slowdown in the economy. It's not a breakdown problem. Yes, I mean, movement of people is still disrupted, but that's only to be expected. There's a lot more coordination as far as sharing of information on the COVID pandemic. And now, of course, we are rolling out the vaccines. And again, there is a fair amount of coordination that is happening at the international level. So I would argue that if you look at how things could have panned out and how they actually did, we did a lot better. And the G20 can definitely take a lot of credit for that. And the basis, I would say, of that coordination is the Global Action Plan, which the G20 came up with in April last year. It was put together, by the way, by the Framework Working Group, which I co-chair. And I know about the amount of effort that went into it, the high-level discussions that happened. And it has been a really great sort of a backbone framework for this coordination I was just mentioning. Moreover, it has been a very flexible and so I would say Bayesian updating step-by-step kind of approach. So we had that in April, and then the G20 then updated the action plan, in October. So, we have updated it, and we intend to update it again in April this year. So every 6 months we are updating it as the response pans out. And each step of this, obviously, as you all know, since many of you have a diplomatic background, that each one of these steps is negotiated, some basic minimum coordination happens, basic language is put together, and the idea of having to do what it takes, really, it's this is a term, by the way, which got included in the action plan and then got used more widely. It was popularized by the action plan itself. So the point I'm making to you is, I think very often people do not give credit to an institution like G20. It can't solve every problem. It's not like it could have somehow avoided the pandemic in the first place. No. But once the pandemic did happen, there was a fair amount of coordination on the financial side, on the health side, and I would argue it continues to do so. So I think the G20 came off rather well from all of this.
Thank you very much. It's a very persuasive argument. I think we often take things for granted, and it's a good way to imagine as to what may have happened to the world without G20. My next question is to Marco, considering that he may be really starting to look at his watch. Marco, Italy was hit very hard, but also it has a strong national recovery plan with advanced manufacturing at its center. As the B20 Sherpa, what do you say as to how Italy will rope in its businesses and small enterprises during its G20 presidency year in order to head towards the recovery, and keeping in mind that the new geoeconomics of the world, the shifting of supply chains, etc., are bringing some changes. So let's have a bit of a focus on the business community, because I just add that we are at Gateway House in particular trying to interest India Inc. more and more on what G20 does. So it would be of interest to know what you are trying to do to engage with the business community.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia, for the interesting and challenging question. I would tackle like this, which is a little bit easier for me because besides being B20 Sherpa, I'm also task force manager for trade and investment. You may know that the B20 on the Italian cycle is divided into, will be operating through 7 task forces and 1 action council. And moreover, we will have a cross-cutting special initiatives that will be dedicated to women empowerment. And I take the chance to inform you that we are finalizing the agenda for the inception meeting, and it will be my pleasure, Ambassador Bhatia, to provide you directly with the link to the inception meeting that will take place on 21st of January between 1 and 3:30 p.m. Central Europe time, and you will have the chance to listen to outstanding international speakers. I can anticipate you that we will have some very, very big names. But coming back to your question, I see 2 figures in the landscapes we're talking about. Regrettably, both figures are negative. One is -10, the other is -40. What do they stand for? -10 stands for the sharp fall of international exchanges, and -40% is the worst scenario that can be expected for the fall down of foreign direct investment. All in all, if these figures will be confirmed with the first quarterly of 2021, but I think we're not very far from that, then at least we know where to intervene primarily to put economic growth back on track and to favor small and medium companies and especially micro companies. As you know, Italy is the land of small and medium companies. It's 99% of our productive tissues is composed by small or very small companies, so we attach specific attention to that. My thought on the shrinking a global value chain that is an issue that is largely debated. I'm afraid there is somebody that has his micro open because I can hear. Oh, okay, much better now. Going regional for global value chain might be an option and might bring some benefits in the very short term, but it cannot work in the medium and in the longest run. We need global value chain, we need interconnections, and we need foreign investment to freely go internationally, worldwide. Basically, we will concentrate on providing the G20 presidencies with policy recommendations of a number of issues that are very closely related to this. One is, for example, tools to boost the access of small and medium companies to export credit and export insurance. There is a tremendous need and an even more tremendous gap between demand and supply. The pandemic has showed that maybe we thought years ago that customs were not a problem any longer. And pandemic has revealed that customs can be terrific bottlenecks. So we need a lot of coordinations among custom authorities. Moreover, the so-called magic formula of level playing field has become a chimera. Business, we're not, let's say, we don't want to listen to talk any longer about level playing field. We need action. The claim of the B20 Italy is reshape the future, include, share, act. We need enforceable decisions, impactful solutions, and we will call on the G20 to undertake concrete actions in these regards. This being said, small and medium companies will have to find their way international also through a selection. There are huge amount of money in all our nations under the form of stimulus packages. In most innovative sectors and most smart companies will have the chance to take the opportunity to undertake a process of upgrading. And besides, I don't know if you agree, but I also see an issue concerning the role of states in the management of economic resources and in the management of economy and companies. So G20 political leaders will have to be very attentive on how to invest this terrific amount of money, keeping in mind that public finance is one big concern, but new competitiveness patterns basically founded on sustainable growth and digitalizations, for example, are also important. So that we'll have to strike a balance and of course, bearing in mind that market forces should be the polar star. And while we look really very much forward, I say it again, for a renewed commitment to a new governance at the trade and investment level. And we hope that the Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization will finally deliver a shared plan of reform where all our countries will commit to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Appreciate the answer. I hope you will stay on, but in case you are constrained to leave, we will fully understand. Let me move to Sanjeev ji, back to you again. We know that there are perhaps about half a dozen very serious, major financial issues that G20 has been trying to address. You made a brief reference earlier. You have been very succinct on this. But I think we really request you to help the audience understand 2 or 3 key financial issues that G20 is tackling, where exactly we are, and where you expect the Italian presidencies to take us into the future.
So let me begin by saying that you have to remember that G20 should not be expected to replace various other existing institutions and financial multilateral. So let me say, for example, G20 is not here to replace the IMF or the BIS or the FSB or any such organization. They all have their agendas. All these G20 countries are represented in the boards of all these institutions. So in some ways, the question is, what is G20 going to do? And I think, as I said at the beginning, G20 plays a role first in terms of providing sort of a big picture framework view of the thing, because all the leaders are there. And so a lot of cross-cutting issues get discussed here that would get lost in silos if they were left to any individual institution. So let me give you an illustration of something we just discussed that sort of played out in the last 1 year. So you will understand what I mean. There is a major issue relating to credit ratings and sovereign ratings, which was an issue a year over the last 1 year because of the following problem. You see, thanks to Financial Stability Board and the work of BIS and so on, over the last since the last financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, virtually every country has adopted some Basel type norms for its financial system. Right now, the Basel type norms, Basel II was being implemented around about the time 2008, and since then, Basel III has also been implemented. Now, what it does is implements on the world's financial systems a set of rules which effectively says that we all end up managing this in more or less the same way. And although some freedom is allowed, effectively what happens is that we all end up using the same credit rating agencies to manage risk. And then the Basel norms hardwire this issue by virtue of putting weight, capital requirements, etc., on what banks and financial institutions can do based on these credit ratings. Now, it may seem like this is a very sensible, uniform way of doing things, but there is a problem. And this is a problem which really comes home when you get hit by a global shock like the one we got hit by in the last 1 year, which is that when you get hit by a sudden shock like this, all the credit rating agencies begin to cut their ratings at the same time. And now, because you have hardwired the amount of capital you have to put against assets or rated various times, you end up with effectively a very pro-cyclical cutting of the pro-cyclical squeezing of the financial system just at the time when the policymakers actually wanted to expand. So what is happening is, like, all the credit ratings begin to come down, So therefore, the banks need to set aside more capital. So effectively, they have to actually shrink back their balance sheets. And this is being done when every central bank really wants them to act pro-cyclical and lend more. I mean, we face this in India, it happens everywhere. And so effectively, you've hardwired into this, into the financial system by virtue of the Basel II and III norms, is something where you have precluded actually anti-cyclical policy making and monetary policy. Now, this is a very serious issue. Now, from the perspective of the individual jurisdiction or individual bank, this is not an issue. But for the system as a whole, this is a real problem because there's no genetic diversity in the system in the way you can think about risk. Now, of course, there is some, even if you allowed everything to really happen, obviously, with the cycle, there will be some ups and downs that will happen pro-cyclically anyway. But now you have actually hardwired it. I.e., if there was a bank or a financial institution which wants to go out there and take extra risk, it is actually not allowed by the current system to do it. Now, this is something that naturally the BIS of FSB would look, or even the IMF would look as an academic problem. And they would just be debating this. But because there is an institution like the G20, which is able to look on the wider issue, cross-cutting between sectors, cross-cutting across countries, we were able to take this up in I can say, specifically in the framework working group. We brought this issue up. It was debated. We brought in the FSB and the BIS, questioned them about this. They consequently started a study. They issued a notification, and many changes have already begun to happen as a result of this. So the immediate, first of all, the sensitization of the problem before it became hit the system. Secondly, it meant that what would typically have, the BIS and FSB, etc. I mean, in the end, these are bureaucracies. They would have in the natural course of things, they would have allowed the system to carry on. But instead, because we provided pressure through the framework working group on them to reconsider these issues and to, make, add language which allows for more freedom, it then got included, by the way, in the action plan as well. It was there very prominently displayed in the action plan about the pro-cyclicality of credit rating. So this then became an issue, and it has been very, very helpful in terms of mitigating this one issue. So I'm just giving this as an example, but this is how it has been. So back to you.
It's very clear. Thank you very much. I'm sure actually if we would have more time, we could go into greater detail, but I'm sure some of our economic experts have understood it far better than probably others. This stage, let me, dear friends, bring the questions from the audience as well, so that there is ownership and engagement. Dr. Basri, I can still see you are here, and this is a question for you. In fact, there will be two questions, brief questions, which would need direct answers. One question or suggestion is coming from Dr. Mohan Kumar, who is the chairman of a prestigious think tank, RIS. His essential suggestion is that G20 should cover a narrower canvas, and it should try to come up with a declaration which has concrete benchmarks. So given your experience, I think you would be in a good position to examine this. In addition, the second question is with regard to the prospects of WTO reform. Although Dr. Mohan Kumar is not asked it, but I think he would be very much interested in this aspect as well. So briefly, if we could get an idea of your views on both these issues, that would be very helpful.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia. Let me try to answer this question briefly. First, about the narrowing the canvas to focus on the several issues. I couldn't agree more. I think in this particular situation, what we need to do is to focus on the several issues. And as I mentioned to you earlier, that we do have the chance and opportunities to do it because we are facing the similar problem all over the world about the global pandemic. And then we have a similarities about the policy as I mentioned, about focusing on the health issue, on the social assistance, supporting the business, I think will be the same all over the world. So this can be used as an entry point because, again, this is my experience. I think it is very important to answer the question is what's in it for me, for every country. Once you can answer that question, then you can have this concerted effort. So I definitely agree that we need to come up with the concrete action, whereas maybe we can discuss later on. In my proposal is we probably need to discuss about the post-COVID, yeah, about the sustainable development, about the issue of inequalities, because I do believe that country like India, Italy, or Indonesia will face the similar issue because the recovery will take in the K shape rather than, because of the rising of the inequality. So that's for the first question. Let me try to answer the second question. This is a tough question. Yeah, the lessons are clear from the Great Depression that when countries retreated to close the market and beggar their neighbor protectionist policies, the recession turned into the global economic depression. And then if we learn from our experience in the G20, the rejection of protectionism, if I'm not mistaken, was in the London G20 summit in April 2009, took the world back from the brink of the world show it does to go down the protection. But the problem is, I think I need to be very realistic as well, yeah, because the prospect of WTO perhaps not as optimistic as what we had, let's say, about 10 years ago. Yeah, we do understand that WTO has been an effective backstop against the surge of protectionism. But the question is, how do we promote this WTO? I think in this particular issue, all the members of the G20 should work together in order to ensure that the WTO reform will continue. And I can propose maybe one of the entry point that will be in the interest of any member of the G20. Is the guaranteeing food and energy security through the international market. Because one thing that we learned from the pandemic, yeah, the risk of the food shortage during the lockdown and social distancing, because every country tried to do the self-sufficient to focus on their domestic issue and restrict export, then this will have an impact to the global issue. So if we can start on something that will be the interest for every country, I think we can somehow promote the interest on the WTO. The second one, I know this is maybe not very popular, but I can see other means before we talk about this WTO reform. Perhaps we can also focus on this, what the so-called the open regionalism. Yeah. In Asia and Pacific countries, we do have the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We can start from that. I can understand that India at this moment until this date is not on board. Yeah, but maybe we can discuss, yeah, about this possibility to ensure that we can avoid the possibility of this danger due to the economic protectionism. I hope I answer your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me go to Sanjeev ji once again. And I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to put two questions to you. One, of course, is on economic issues, but the other one is on broader political issue. And I know you are very comfortable in that domain as well. Mudit Jain, one of the members of the audience, is asking, will India's governing standards, parameters for a healthy economy be under the radar when it is a part of G20? Of course, India is part of G20, but maybe he's referring to eventually when India comes into the leadership position. The second question, which I hinted, is very relevant to today, which is this. Will according to your assessment or in your assessment, will the Biden administration with his call for a summit of the world's leading democracies make a difference for the prospects of G20? Will the D10, which has been proposed by Britain by way of an expansion of G7, will that empower or weaken G20? So if you could kindly take care of Mudit's query and the broader thing which is totally relevant now that may be unfolding in the next few weeks, that would be very helpful to all of us.
Well, obviously, I can't comment on anything related to short-term fiscal or anything policy because we will present the budget shortly. But I would say that main point that Mudit is making is really, does it mean that when we are in the leadership position in 2023, will we come under greater scrutiny? Yeah, well, it's possible, yes. If you are the leader, people watch you more closely. But on the other hand, I can say that we have managed this particular crisis very, very well. And I think there's greater appreciation of the approach that India took. We did come under a lot of criticism initially about the fact that we did take a approach to both the economic and the health crisis in a way that is different from what many other countries did. But I think there is an appreciation now that it was the right thing to do. So instead of, for example, on the economic front, most experts told us to do sort of a one grand big bang revival package. We instead went for much smaller, medium-sized packages, but several of them panned over a period of time. And we did so. This particular approach, as you can see, has turned out to be correct, and our economy is reviving far faster than that of those economies that went for a one big bang approach. And you can see that in every monthly number that is coming out. GST numbers are already above last year's levels. Car sales are well above, electricity consumption. Virtually every fast-moving indicator, other than for maybe travel and tourism and entertainment, every other indicator is now well above where it was a year ago, suggesting that the Indian approach of a Bayesian step-by-step response has been appreciated, and that's happening on the health front as well. I mean, our infection rates are coming down very sharply, and of course, India is going to be a very important part of the solution to the pandemic worldwide in terms of our supply of vaccines as well. So, in that sense, I think there is a greater appreciation of the way we have handled this. Another way in which we have been very different from the rest of the world's approach is that we have, unlike virtually any other country, put in a lot of emphasis on supply side and structural reforms through this entire process. So we have done politically difficult reforms, whether it's farm reforms, labor laws, telecom regulations for the BPO sector. I can give you a long list of structural reforms that we have done. So I think the Indian government's response to this is getting appreciated. And I think 6 months' time, its success will be even clearer. So if the question was, will it have greater scrutiny? Yes, and that's great because that will allow us to show the fact that our government is able to respond responsibly and strongly to whatever challenges are thrown at us. Now, as far as the issue about D10 is concerned, let me say that one has to be very clear what the role these things play. What is the role of G20? I discussed this earlier. It was to basically manage the global commons and to allow a degree of coordination between countries for things that we cannot do ourselves. Now, clearly, by virtue of the fact that this is a D10, it means that you're leaving out several important countries, not to mention, not the least China itself, but also several others. Now, in that situation, then the D10 cannot be asked to, will not be able to do certain things that G20 is able to do because it doesn't take an ideological position on anything. It is just a purely functional position on being able to get, these coordination governance issues done. The moment you bring into it sort of some sort of a preconception of how a particular country runs itself internally, then it opens itself to other debates. Now, those debates are important debates. So there is a place for D10, but I don't think D10 is a replacement for G20 in any way. They are different things for different purposes, and one should be very clear which group is doing what. So, so I would argue that yes, there is a place for D10, but the debates and discussions that will happen in D10 are not the debates and discussions that happened in G20. They are totally different things.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me come to Dr. Basri again. As we know, G20 is entering a key phase with 3 I's: Italy, a developed country, followed by 2 dynamic developing countries, India and Indonesia. What contribution can Indonesia and India make during their presidency years with their unique worldview on the world's economic steering committee?
Oh, this is a very good question. Since I'm no longer in the government, ambassador, perhaps I can speak more openly and freely. Yeah. I always call India is Indonesia without resources, because we have a lot of similarities in terms of this population, the vibrant democracy, decentralization, very similar. And even during my time when I was a finance minister, we had to face the similar problem as well. And then both countries, survived the taper tantrum in 2013. Yeah. So I will propose several issues, which I do believe, of course, I cannot talk on behalf of India, but I think there are several issues that perhaps will become a big issue in the future. I mentioned to you earlier regarding the post-COVID. Yeah, my biggest concern is I do believe that the recovery is taking place. If I'm talking about Indonesia, perhaps the GDP growth for this year will be around between -1.5 to -2. Yeah, we've been through the worst. In the second quarter was -5.3. So the recovery will take place like the was shaped like the Nike logo brand. Yeah, but my concern is if you're talking about sectoral and if you're talking about income group, then there is a risk of the K-shape, because some group of people who are able to sort of like save the money, or they do have savings, perhaps they can survive from this crisis in a better way than the middle and lower income group. And the one who also have an access for the digital will survive this pandemic. Yeah, so there is a risk of the K-shaped recovery because inequality is rising. So I can imagine maybe during the after Italy and Indonesia presidency in India, this will become a very big issue, the post-COVID. Yeah, the issue of inequality. How do we deal with the issue of inequality? And I may propose, to every government all over the world, including my government here in Indonesia and also India. I think it is very important from the beginning to design the fiscal policy, in favor to address the issue of this inequality, which is focusing on the social protection, on the health, access for health, training, rescaling, to address the issue of the digital divide. That kind of model, perhaps one of the potential common platform. The second one, we also need to take this opportunity that the recovery from the post-COVID should be sustainable, should be environmental friendly, because the interest rate is relatively low now. So there is a chance for all of us to discuss about the sustainable development. Yeah, and one of the proposal, I wrote this piece with 2 of my colleagues and the project syndicate. I know this is not very popular, but since I'm no longer in the government, I can propose this. I think for some countries, it is very important, for example, to eliminate the fuel subsidies while the oil price is relatively low. Yeah, because if we eliminate the fuel subsidies during the high oil price, like I experienced this in 2013, I have to adjust the fuel price by 40% at that time, and there was a sort of like a protest. But at this moment, when the oil price is relatively low, there is a room to do it. And I think I call this policy as a triple win, because it will reduce the demand for fossil fuel, which is good for environment, and we can use this money to support the financing for health for the pandemic, or to protect the poor people by giving the direct cash transfer. And this is good for macro as well, because we can address the issue of the primary balance, etc. So good for the environment, good for poor people, and good for macro. That's the second one. And the third one, we probably need to discuss about the digital transformation, because one thing that we learned from this pandemic is, I call this is accidental transformation. The digital technology is there, but because the pandemic, we have to expedite the transformation process. But the problem is country, I don't know, maybe similar in India and Indonesia, is digital divide. Not all over Indonesia have the same access for the digital. So I think we probably need to sort of like to focus on this issue as well, especially once this digital transformation is taking place, then we will see the problem of the disruption. That is why we'll have also an impact on the employment, inequalities, etc. So probably that there are some several issues that perhaps that we can discuss during the Italia, Indonesia, and India presidencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I think, the emphasis on these three elements, equality, sustainability, and digital transformation, these are such striking common features between India and Indonesia that you're talking about this obviously carries conviction. Thank you. Sanjeev ji, once again, back to you. I think we are nearing the end of our time, but that's the reason why I'm putting two questions. I think they're both coming from the audience. I think this is Ambassador Gurjeet Singh. First question is, how sustainable is the debt relief program of G20? And the other one that's come up is, in your example of the credit rating system, there are developed country biases in them. How can these be addressed by countries like India and Indonesia?
Okay, so let me answer the second question first. Obviously, there are developed, he's absolutely right. There are developed country biases that are there in the credit rating system. One of the reasons, India particularly raised this issue during this initial phase of the crisis and raised it with the FSB and in the G20 platforms, that, there was when you have this sort of crisis and this pro-cyclicality built into it, then the emerging market companies and emerging market countries, because it's not just companies, but sovereign ratings get downgraded. And if you see waves of sovereign rating downgrades, then immediately you actually cause the crisis because you have a spiraling effect. So, there is absolutely a lot of built-in issues. I mean, if you, for example, one of the criteria that is there in sovereign ratings, people don't realize, is actually per capita income. So India, which is a poor country, will get a lower rating than an identical country which may have a much worse record on repaying its external debt. But just because we are poorer, we will be treated worse. So this is something we've raised many times, but I'm just pointing out to you, it comes to roost in some sense in these situations. So G20, by bringing up this issue and pushing against it, has sensitized people against it, and we will keep at it. At least at the framework working group, we have taken up this issue, and you will find that it appears very prominently in the global action plan. And but in the longer run, ultimately, one, you have to push against not only against these rating agencies, ultimately you need a greater diversity of rating agencies. As things stand, basically it's a oligopoly of about 3 companies,
Yes.
and all 3 companies are
We lost.
Western, North Atlantic.
Yeah, carry on, please.
Now, for your other question, sorry, I forget the first question.
Yeah, the first one is how sustainable is the debt relief program?
So this is a tricky question and a very clever question, because the fact of the matter is, it is given the huge amount of spending that all countries have done, this obviously means we have all run up large amounts of debt. Now, in the particular case of India, we have been much more careful than many others. But even here, obviously, our debt to GDP ratio will rise. There's no question about that. Even when our GDP begins growing and revenues flow back, we will be taking on a certain amount of load, but hopefully we'll repay it over time. But we have taken on new debts. Other countries, particularly in the West, will have also the additional problem that they grow slower. So, the debt to GDP ratio is not only affected by the numerator, but the denominator itself grows much slower. Now, in this context, the reason it is sustainable right now is the fact that capital is so cheap. So all of this is being funded effectively at very, very low interest rates, effectively 0 interest rates. Now, the problem will really become serious if ever in the future interest rates have to be increased, and all of this debt then comes to roost and has to be rolled over at higher interest rates. That will be a very tricky place. So now, let's say at some point in the future, if inflation begins to come back and comes back strongly, then effectively what will happen is a lot of this, of course, we will be burning up the debt by inflating it away, but it will cause all kinds of tricky problems because many countries will not be able to increase interest rates in conjunction. Now, again, India doesn't have 0 interest rates, so we are in a slightly better position. But this is something that we need to be wary of, particularly given the fact that obviously this money that is sloshing around will eventually also begin to inflate things like oil prices and things like that. So there is a very fine balance that we need to look at. If the world financial system is sloshing with money, which is fine right now maybe, but once it begins to feed through to inflation, if it feeds through to inflationary pressures, then and interest rates begin to rise, then obviously the dynamics of debt will begin to play into a completely different direction. So this is a tricky game that we have to play, but it has to be watched, and there is no easy answer to it. It's more about managing yourself out of it. There is no do this step by step, A, B, C, D, E. It's a lot about the managing of it that matters.
Thank you so much. We understand this. We are nearing the end of our panel discussion. I think I now wanted to request our 2 panelists to take just about a minute each and touch anything that we may not have covered. We have other questions, but we always go by time. And in this context, in case Dr. Basri, for example, you could highlight what, according to you, as Ambassador Surendra Kumar is asking, the biggest achievement of G20 in 2020?
Well, since I'm no longer in the G20, perhaps I cannot give the exact answer for this question, but as someone that outside on the G20 forum now, my understanding is by reading from the newspaper and the media, I think based on the communique made on the G20, they asked for every country to focus on the issue is getting the pandemic under control should be the top priority. And I do believe that, every the G20 member is also focusing on this issue. So I cannot answer perhaps for the 2020, but let me share my experience during my time. I do believe that the role of G20 is very important, to discuss, to exchange the policy, to discuss about the, to design the concerted effort. So I do believe that we can use this G20 forum to help the global economy during the pandemic as well. Yeah, sorry, I cannot specifically answer about this.
No, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Sanjeev ji, to you, as you in a minute round up anything that you may wish to cover, kindly also check and cover the question. What, according to you, would be the biggest challenge for G20 in these 3 years that we are talking about, 21, 22, 23?
So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we need to be very clear about what is expected of the G20. It's about coordination and things that are related to the global commons. It's not about individual country policy, really. That's not what G20 is there to do. And so in that context, I think G20 did a reasonable job. I mean, global financial flows are flowing. Global trade may have shrunk, but that's because of the impact of a slowdown in the economy. There's no breakdown. I mean, goods are going back and forth. Global trade is happening. Supply chains may have been occasionally disrupted, but by and large, they're still functioning. And I think G20 deserves some credit for that. Similarly, I think there's after the initial hiccups, and as I said, with the problems that other institutions like WHO had, I think the global health response has also kind of been much more, has caught up. The rollout of the vaccines are happening. So I think by and large, G20 has kept things going much better than people would have expected did it not exist. And so we have not yet had, say, as I said, an emerging market crisis or any other kinds of things that people may have feared. So I think G20 can take credit for it. The action plan did what it was supposed to do. It was updated again in October. And now again, we are putting up in April an updated one. And obviously the updated one in April will focus on reconstruction and rebuilding. Because by that time, presumably, enough of the vaccine has been rolled out. And the bottom as far as the economic cycle has already been hit. So the big issues will be rebuilding. And this rebuilding will happen, obviously, in a context where you have very impaired balance sheets in every country. So how do you rebuild when you have basically spent all you could and have run up all the debt? So here, the issue that I discussed earlier, how do you get out of this? Make sure, for example, even if individual countries, for example, think that they need to begin to tighten monetary policy, particularly the bigger ones, don't do it too suddenly, because that will cause taper tantrums in the world. So that has, particularly the US has to do this very smoothly. You need to coordinate, for example, if there are particular countries which continue to be in trouble, they have to be provided support from outside. There is various kinds of moratoria that are still there in terms of debt repayments within countries and externally. Those moratorias will slowly come off. So these things will have to get discussed at Paris Club or whatever is the appropriate forum. So all of those unwindings and coming out of the crisis mode will happen in 3-4 months' time when we get to that stage. And I think G20 again will play a very, very important role in all of this. And over the next 3 years, and I can tell you, even when we take up the presidency in 3 years' time, we will find that the rebuilding is still going on. I mean, this is the biggest shock the world has seen in 100 years, and I can assure you that we will still be facing the aftermath even at that stage. So I think in that context, the foundations that we have laid as far as G20 coordination are quite good. I think too much cynicism, it's a talk shop, nothing happens, that's not fair. The world was kept going by this group for whatever it's worth. And I think it did step up to the challenge. Which other organization would have done it? The UN wouldn't have done it. No other organization would have done it.
Thank you very much for that very calibrated assessment, which is infused with optimism. I think this is the key to action, and it would be noted that through a variety of questions, both from Gateway House and from our very distinguished and honored audience, we have been able to cover a vast range of aspects of G20, but still we are obviously in need of much more to know and create a wider awareness. At this stage, without really taking any more time in terms of summation, etc., I would like to request Mr. Peter Rimmel, resident representative of CAS, who's been our steady partner and collaborator, to deliver the closing comments.
Thank you. Dr. Basri, Mr. Marco Felisati in absentia, Mr. Sanjay Sanyal, Ambassador Bhatia, my dear Manjit, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I stand really enlightened about what the G20 will bring in the next crucial 3 years. I therefore like to thank all our great speakers and everyone behind the lines who have made this event possible. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living through times where what we call the new is being redefined every day because of the extremely pacey dynamics of change. And this is especially true in the field of multilateral international platforms, including the G20, about which we have been uniquely privileged to hear today from the notable panelists of the 3I. For nearly a year, we have seen nations working assiduously to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, which has proven not only to be a health crisis, but a social, economic, and human crisis that has hit us all hard and has severely impacted lives and livelihoods. We had seen that local problems can swiftly become global challenges. And in my opinion, and luckily I'm not alone, multilateralism is one, if not the key to these challenges. The closure of countries, as Mr. Felisati has mentioned at the beginning of the pandemic, for sure was not the right answer. The G20, bringing together much of the world's population and its economy, Manjit gave the figures before, as a crucial economic multilateral platform because of its size and its strategic importance, needs to play a critical role as it did during the 1990 Asian financial crisis and the 2008 global financial crisis, as mentioned by Dr. Basri. Therefore, with the underlying objective of strengthening cooperation, multilateralism, and global partnership, G20 will play an important role to revitalize global economic governance and foster crucial synergies, with the focus being of the 3 Ps in this year: people, planet, and prosperity. And I feel these 3 pillars need to be coalesced with the other 3 Ps, what should stand for partnership, policies, and priorities, in order to be achieved, what our Italian friend on the panel also laid emphasis on. The 3 interconnected pillars of action, people, planet, and prosperity, which I feel are somehow synonymous to life, livelihood, and growth. In order to have a balance between these, we need to ensure proper partnership, targeted policies, and get our priorities right. Talking about priorities, obviously, focusing on the good health of the citizens requires unprecedented attention of the governments across the globe. I feel Germany is a staunch advocate for the same. The Hamburg G20 meeting during Germany's presidency in 2017, and maybe that answers one of the questions I saw in the chat, was the first to include a comprehensive health track in its discussions. And now, with the outbreak of COVID-19, it becomes all the more imperative to address such global challenges and put important issues like health on the forefront of the global agenda. The heartening fact that the Italian presidency and the European Commission will jointly host the G20 Global Health Summit in Rome in May this year, which at the highest level will enable us to respond to the major challenges linked to the health crisis. And maybe the thinking that vaccines are not national goods, but maybe rather a new commons, could also be increased there. To seek refuge in dreams of national self-dependence as an answer to this crisis, even sometimes drifting to some kind of, call it Stone Age nationalism, is a one-way road. Multilateralism is the only road that can lead to the global and the goal of addressing the needs of the planet. It is an absolute necessity for our common well-being, international peace and security, and ultimately for our long-term survival on this pale blue dot. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm of the firm belief that multilateralism will emerge stronger and more deeply entrenched than ever before from this crucible of COVID-19, even though we cannot deny that strong forces beyond the current crisis are at work to change the fundamentals of our world order. Let me conclude. There are several countries that uphold a values-based multilateral world order, and we have to stand strong and we have to stand together. Upholding the beliefs of Konrad Adenauer, modern Germany's first chancellor, we believe that it's enormously important that our vision, and there I would like to include Gateway House for the G20, remains a vision for the world at large. If G20 is living up to its expectations, as Mr. Sanjay Janyal has formulated it, we will find out. But our event today clearly did. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rimel. It's left, I think, to Manjeet to say once again on behalf of Gateway House the final word of thanks. Manjeet, you are muted.
So thank you all very much for coming to this extremely enlightening meeting, Sanjeev and Dr. Basri. I'm sorry Marco is not here, but really this is a sort of a kickoff for India's presidency, upcoming presidency. Sanjeev, you've really explained things in a very simple manner about what the G20 means for India and why we should be participating in it. And Dr. Basri, we really look forward to Indonesia and India holding hands with Italy to bring forward an agenda that is really more balanced and that takes the emerging markets and developing countries, their presence and their positions into account when all the big economic standards are being set for the world by which the world works. So look forward to a year when the three ladies, the three eyes, really bring the G20 to a different level. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to next month where we will meet again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice.
Thank you very much.